The 20-degree morning in Boulder, Colorado hit me like a freight train when I stepped outside to grab the newspaper, and I knew my electric heating bill was about to skyrocket if I didn't find a solution fast. I'm Cameron Richardson, and I'd been living in the Pinewood Meadows subdivision for about 3 years now, never causing trouble, always paying my dues on time, and generally keeping to myself in my modest 2-story home on Maple Drive. The power grid in our area had been struggling lately, with rolling brownouts becoming more common as the winter pushed harder into January. My electric furnace was working overtime, and after seeing last month's bill climb to nearly $400, I decided enough was enough. I remembered my grandfather using a kerosene heater in his workshop back in Minnesota, and after doing some research, I figured it would be the perfect supplemental heat source to take the load off my main system. I drove down to the hardware store on Pearl Street and picked up a quality Sengoku kerosene heater, the kind with all the modern safety features built right in. The guy at the counter, an older fellow named Pete, assured me it was one of the best models they carried. It had an automatic shutoff if it tipped over, a carbon monoxide detector integration, and proper ventilation specifications. I grabbed 2 5-gallon containers and filled them at the gas station on my way home. Setting it up in my living room took maybe 20 minutes. I followed all the instructions to the letter, made sure I had proper ventilation by cracking a window slightly, and kept my carbon monoxide detectors fresh with new batteries. The heat it produced was immediate and comforting, spreading through my downstairs like a warm blanket. My thermostat for the electric heat dropped from 72 to 65, and I could already imagine the savings adding up. For the first week, everything was perfect. The kerosene heater hummed quietly in the corner of my living room, and my house stayed comfortable despite the brutal cold outside. I was working from home as a software developer, so being able to maintain a warm workspace without breaking the bank felt like a major victory. My cat, Mr. Whiskers, even seemed to appreciate the radiant heat, often curling up at a safe distance from the unit. Then came the knock on my door. It was a Tuesday afternoon around 2 o'clock. I was deep into debugging some code when the sharp rap on my front door pulled me away from my computer. I opened it to find a woman I recognized as Patricia Henderson, the president of our homeowners association. She was probably in her mid-50s, with that particular hairstyle that somehow defied both gravity and logic, and she wore a puffy winter coat over what looked like a tennis outfit. Her face had that pinched expression I'd seen on various neighbors when they were about to complain about something trivial. "Mr. Richardson," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I'm here regarding a serious safety concern." I blinked, confused. "A safety concern? What's wrong?" "May I come in?" She didn't wait for an answer, pushing past me into my entryway. Her eyes immediately locked onto the kerosene heater across the room. That is what's wrong. My heater." I closed the door behind her, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "What about it?" Patricia pulled out a tablet from her oversized purse and began scrolling through something. "I received a complaint from Deborah Brooks next door. She claims she's been smelling kerosene fumes for the past week and is concerned about her family's safety. Additionally, according to our HOA covenants, specifically Section 12, Paragraph 4, Subsection B, the use of any open flame heating devices or potentially hazardous fuel-based heating systems within residential properties is strictly prohibited without prior written approval from the board." I felt my jaw tighten. That's the first I'm hearing about this, and for the record, I'm not using an open flame device. This is a sealed combustion unit with multiple safety features. The covenant doesn't distinguish between types of fuel-based heating, Patricia replied, her tone suggesting she'd rehearsed this speech. The fact remains that you're using kerosene, a flammable substance, to heat your home. This poses a risk not just to your property but to the entire neighborhood. I'm here to formally request that you cease using this device immediately. Request or demand? I asked, already knowing the answer. Consider it a demand, she said, tapping something on her tablet. I'm documenting this visit. You have 48 hours to remove the device and discontinue its use. If you fail to comply, the HOA will be forced to take action, including potential fines of $100 per day, until compliance is achieved. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. Patricia, I've done everything by the book here. This heater is all listed. It has safety certifications, and I'm using it responsibly. My electric bills have been killing me, and with the power grid issues we've been having, this seemed like a sensible backup option. Your personal financial concerns don't supersede community safety regulations, she said, heading back toward the door. 48 hours, Mr. Richardson. I expect full compliance. She left before I could respond further, leaving me standing in my living room feeling like I'd just been hit by a legal sledgehammer. I immediately pulled up the HOA covenants on my computer, scrolling through page after page of dense legal language until I found the section she'd referenced. Sure enough, there it was, buried in the middle of a paragraph about fire safety. No fuel-based heating systems without board approval. The thing that irritated me most wasn't even the rule itself, but the fact that I'd never seen any evidence of Deborah Brooks complaining about smells. Her house was a good 30 feet from mine, separated by a fence and some mature evergreen trees. There was no way kerosene fumes were bothering her, especially since I kept my doors and windows mostly closed and the heater was vented properly. This felt personal, though I couldn't figure out why. That evening, I decided to be proactive. I walked next door to Deborah's house, a craftsman-style place with an immaculate yard and one of those wooden signs that said "Blessed and Grateful" hanging by the front door. Deborah answered on the second knock, and I recognized her from neighborhood gatherings. She was younger than Patricia, maybe early 40s, with blonde highlights and yoga clothes that probably cost more than my heating bill. "Cameron, hi," she said, seeming genuinely surprised to see me. "Hey, Deborah. I wanted to talk to you about the complaint you filed with the HOA about my kerosene heater." Her face immediately shifted, a mix of confusion and something like guilt crossing her features. "Complaint? I didn't file any complaint." Now it was my turn to be confused. "Patricia Henderson was just at my house. She said you complained about kerosene fumes coming from my place." Deborah shook her head. "I never said anything to Patricia or anyone else. Honestly, I didn't even know you were using a kerosene heater. I haven't smelled anything unusual." We stood there for a moment, the cold air seeping into both our homes through our open doors. "So you never contacted the HOA about this?" "Absolutely not," she said firmly. "Look, I try to stay out of HOA drama as much as possible. Patricia has a way of manufacturing problems where none exist. Last month she tried to fine the Thompsons because their Christmas lights were up 3 days past the deadline in the covenants. Would you be willing to put that in writing?" I asked. "That you never filed a complaint." She hesitated, and I could see the wheels turning. Going against Patricia meant potentially putting a target on her own back. "Let me think about it," she finally said. "I don't want to get dragged into HOA politics, but I also don't want to see you get fined for something based on a lie." I thanked her and walked back to my house, my mind racing. Patricia had either lied about who complained or had made up the complaint entirely. Either way, I was now in the crosshairs of someone who clearly had too much time on her hands and enjoyed wielding what little power she had. The next morning, I received an email from the HOA with an official notice of violation attached as a PDF. It reiterated everything Patricia had said, complete with a deadline of Thursday at 5 p.m. to cease using the kerosene heater. The fine structure was also confirmed, $100 per day, with the potential for legal action if I remained in violation for more than 30 days. I spent my lunch break researching alternatives. If I was going to have to give up the kerosene heater, I wanted something equally efficient and cost-effective. That's when I stumbled onto infrared heaters. They were electric, which technically should satisfy the HOA's concerns about fuel-based systems, but they worked differently than traditional space heaters. Instead of heating air, they heated objects and people directly, like the sun. The energy efficiency was supposedly much better than standard electric heaters, and they wouldn't spike my electricity bill nearly as much as running the furnace constantly. I found a highly rated infrared heater online, a model from Dr. Infrared heater that had excellent reviews and could heat up to 1,000 square feet. It was pricier than the kerosene unit, running about $250, but if it kept the HOA off my back and still saved me money, it would be worth it. I ordered it with overnight shipping. Thursday morning, I drained the kerosene heater, cleaned it according to the manual, and boxed it back up. By the time the infrared heater arrived around 3 p.m., I had everything ready to swap out. The new unit was larger than I expected, about 20 inches tall and 16 inches wide, with a dark walnut finish that actually looked pretty nice in my living room. It had a digital thermostat, a remote control, and multiple heat settings. I plugged it in, turned it to medium, and within minutes I could feel the warmth radiating toward me. It wasn't quite the same as the kerosene heater. The warmth was more directional, concentrated where the infrared rays hit. But standing in front of it felt like standing in sunshine, and I had to admit it was pleasant. I took photos of the boxed-up kerosene heater and the new infrared unit, documenting my compliance for the HOA. I sent an email to Patricia that evening with the photos attached. Per your demand, I have ceased using the kerosene heater and have switched to an electric infrared heating system. Trust this resolves the issue. Her response came within an hour. Mr. Richardson, I need to inspect your property to verify compliance. I will be by tomorrow at 9 a.m. I resisted the urge to type out several choice responses and simply replied that 9 a.m. would be fine. The next morning, I made sure everything was spotless, and the kerosene heater was clearly visible in its box by the door, ready to be stored in my garage. Patricia arrived exactly at 9, accompanied by another HOA board member I didn't recognize, a thin man in his 60s wearing a button-up shirt and khakis. "This is Gerald Peters, our vice president," Patricia said as they entered. "He's here to witness the inspection." Gerald gave me an apologetic nod. He seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation, which gave me some hope that not everyone on the board was as aggressive as Patricia. They walked through my living room, Patricia taking photos with her phone while Gerald mostly just looked around. She stopped at the infrared heater, examining it closely. "What exactly is this device?" she asked. "It's an electric infrared heater," I explained. "Completely different from the kerosene unit. No fuel, no combustion, just electricity. It heats through infrared radiation, similar to how the sun works." Patricia frowned, tapping on her phone. "And you're certain this doesn't violate any safety codes? It's all certified, plugs into a standard outlet, and doesn't require any special installation or ventilation." "It's essentially just a more efficient space heater." Gerald spoke up for the first time. "Looks fine to me, Patricia. It's just an electric heater. Lots of people use these." She didn't look pleased but seemed to accept it. They verified that the kerosene heater was indeed packed away, checked that I didn't have any fuel containers in the house, and finally headed toward the door. "We'll consider this matter resolved," Patricia said, though her tone suggested she wasn't happy about it. "However, I'll be monitoring the situation. If there are any further complaints or concerns, we'll need to revisit this." "Complaints from who?" I asked pointedly. "Because Deborah Brooks told me she never filed the original complaint." Patricia's face tightened. "HOA matters are confidential, Mr. Richardson. Have a good day." They left, and I felt like I'd won a small victory, even though the whole situation still irritated me. I'd spent money I hadn't planned to spend, been forced to change my heating solution, and had my home invaded by HOA busybodies, all based on what seemed to be a fabricated complaint. The infrared heater worked well enough over the next few weeks. My electric bill was higher than it would have been with kerosene, but lower than running the furnace full blast. The cold snap continued through February, with temperatures regularly dropping into the teens overnight. My work-from-home setup stayed comfortable, and I mostly forgot about the whole HOA drama until the next notice appeared in my mailbox in early March. This time, it was about the infrared heater. According to the new notice, Patricia had brought my unusual heating device before the full HOA board at their monthly meeting, and they had decided it required further investigation. The notice stated that while electric heaters were generally allowed, infrared heating technology wasn't specifically addressed in the covenants, and therefore might constitute a non-standard modification to home climate control systems. I read the notice 3 times, certain I was missing something. They were now claiming that using a plug-in electric heater, something you could buy at any hardware store, might be against HOA rules because the technology wasn't specifically mentioned in covenants that were probably written 20 years ago. The notice requested that I appear at the next HOA board meeting to discuss the matter and potentially request a variance for the device. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 p.m. at the community center. I called my friend Marcus, who worked as a real estate attorney in Denver. After explaining the situation, he laughed so hard I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "Cameron, this is absurd," he said once he caught his breath. "They can't regulate what kind of electric heater you use. That's like saying you need permission to use a toaster instead of a toaster oven. Are your HOA covenants really that broad?" I've read them front to back now. There's nothing about space heaters specifically. The only mention of heating systems is about the main HVAC and not modifying it without approval. "Then they're reaching," Marcus said. "You're not modifying anything. You're using a portable electric device that anyone can buy. Unless there's specific language about portable heating units, they don't have a leg to stand on. Should I be worried about this? Honestly, it sounds like someone on the board, probably this Patricia person, has it out for you. My advice is to go to the meeting, bring documentation about the heater's safety certifications and energy efficiency, and calmly explain that you're in full compliance with all covenants. If they try to fine you anyway, you'd have grounds to challenge it legally." I thanked him and spent the weekend preparing for the meeting. I printed out the heater's specifications, safety certifications, energy efficiency ratings, and even found several articles about how infrared heaters were becoming increasingly popular as supplemental heating sources. I also documented my communication with Deborah Brooks, including her statement that she never filed a complaint about the kerosene heater. Tuesday evening arrived with temperatures finally starting to climb into the 40s. Spring was teasing us with the possibility of arrival. I walked to the community center at 6:45, finding it mostly empty except for a few board members setting up folding chairs and a table at the front. The community center was a plain building with beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and that particular smell of old carpet and cleaning products. Patricia sat at the center of the table with Gerald to her right. 3 other board members I vaguely recognized from neighborhood events filled out the rest of the seats. By 7, maybe a dozen other residents had trickled in, most of them probably there for other agenda items. The meeting started with roll call, approval of last month's minutes, and a discussion about repainting the community sign at the entrance to the subdivision. Finally, Patricia shuffled her papers and looked directly at me. Next item: discussion of non-standard heating device at 342 Maple Drive, the residence of Mr. Cameron Richardson. Mr. Richardson, would you please come forward? I walked to the front, my folder of documentation in hand. The other residents watched with mild interest, probably grateful that someone else was in the hot seat this time. Mr. Richardson, Patricia began, after your compliance with our previous directive regarding the kerosene heater, the board has become aware that you've installed an infrared heating device. While we appreciate your effort to comply with the fuel-based heating prohibition, we have concerns about this new device. What concerns specifically? I asked. Infrared heating technology isn't explicitly addressed in our covenants, which were adopted in 2003. This creates a gray area regarding whether such devices are permitted without board approval. Gerald leaned forward, looking uncomfortable again. Patricia, with respect, lots of technology isn't explicitly addressed in our covenants because it didn't exist when they were written. We don't mention LED light bulbs or smart thermostats either, but people use them. That's different, Patricia snapped. This is a heating device that could potentially affect property values and neighborhood standards. How would an infrared heater affect property values? I asked. It's inside my home, not visible from the street, and it's just a more efficient way of using electricity I'm already paying for. One of the other board members, a woman named Susan, spoke up. I actually have a question. What's the difference between this and a regular space heater? My daughter uses space heaters in her apartment. I seized the opportunity. The main difference is efficiency. Traditional space heaters warm the air, which then has to circulate to heat a room. Infrared heaters work like sunlight, directly warming objects and people through electromagnetic radiation. It's safer in some ways because there's no heating element that gets extremely hot, and it uses less electricity to achieve the same comfort level. I opened my folder and pulled out the documentation I'd prepared. I have the manufacturer's specifications here, along with OL certification, energy efficiency ratings, and safety test results. This device is sold at major retailers across the country and is considered a standard electric appliance. Patricia barely glanced at the papers as I set them on the table. The issue isn't whether it's safe or efficient. The issue is whether it requires board approval as a non-standard device. But it's not non-standard, I said, trying to keep frustration out of my voice. You can buy this at Home Depot. Thousands of people use them. In our community, we maintain certain standards, Patricia insisted. If we allow residents to use whatever devices they want without oversight, it creates a slippery slope. What's next? Propane heaters. Wood stoves. Those use fuel and produce combustion products, I countered. This is electricity. It's fundamentally different. The meeting devolved into a back and forth that went nowhere. Gerald and Susan seemed sympathetic to my position, but the other 2 board members stayed silent, apparently content to let Patricia lead. Eventually, Patricia called for a vote on whether to require me to seek a formal variance for the infrared heater. The vote was 3-2 in favor, with Gerald and Susan dissenting. I now had to fill out a variance application, pay a $50 processing fee, and wait for the board to review and approve it at next month's meeting. In the meantime, I was technically allowed to continue using the heater, but Patricia made it clear that if the variance was denied, I'd be required to remove it. I left the meeting feeling angry and defeated. The whole thing was ridiculous. I was being harassed over a common electric appliance because Patricia had decided I was her new project. Walking home in the cold evening air, I wondered if moving to a neighborhood without an HOA might be worth the hassle. Over the next few days, I stewed over the situation. I filled out the variance application, which asked absurd questions like, how will this modification enhance the community? And what alternatives did you consider? I was tempted to write sarcastic answers but kept it professional, explaining the energy efficiency benefits and the need for supplemental heating during grid stress events. The $50 processing fee felt like extortion, but I paid it. What choice did I have? Refusing to comply would just give them ammunition to fine me or place a lien on my property. I submitted everything by the deadline and tried to get back to my normal routine. Work kept me busy, and the warming weather meant I was using the heater less anyway. But the whole situation gnawed at me. I found myself checking the HOA website obsessively, looking at past meeting minutes and trying to understand if Patricia had targeted other residents like this. What I found was interesting. Over the past year, Patricia had initiated violation notices against almost a dozen homeowners for various minor infractions. Grass slightly too tall, outdoor Christmas decorations up a few days too long, a basketball hoop that was 6 inches into the prohibited zone near the street. In every case, she'd been the one to file the complaint, and in most cases, the violations seemed petty and technical. But there was a pattern. Almost all the targets were people who had previously disagreed with her at board meetings or who had voted against her on some community issue. I started digging deeper into HOA records, which were technically public for association members. I found that Patricia had been president for 3 years, having run unopposed each time. Before her presidency, the association had been relatively quiet, with maybe 1 or 2 notices per year. Under Patricia's leadership, enforcement actions had increased tenfold. I started reaching out to other residents who'd been on the receiving end of her violations. The Thompsons, who'd been fined over Christmas lights, told me they'd voted against one of Patricia's proposals to increase HOA dues. The Hendersons, no relation to Patricia, had been cited for parking their RV in their driveway for more than 48 hours after they'd questioned her about how dues were being spent at a meeting. A picture was emerging of someone who used HOA rules as a weapon against anyone who challenged her authority. But knowing that and doing something about it were 2 different things. The next HOA board meeting arrived in early April. Spring had finally taken hold, and I'd barely used the infrared heater in the past 2 weeks. I showed up at the community center to find it more crowded than usual. Word had apparently spread about my variance request, and people were curious. The meeting followed its usual pattern of mundane business until Patricia got to my variance application. She read through my responses with a tone that suggested she found them amusing. Mr. Richardson is requesting a variance to use an infrared heating device in his residence, she announced to the room. The board has reviewed his application and supporting documentation. I'd like to open this up for discussion before we vote. Gerald immediately spoke. I don't see any reason to deny this. He's using a standard electric appliance. We're not in the business of regulating what brand of toaster or television people buy. This shouldn't be different. The covenant specifically addresses heating systems, Patricia argued. Any modification or addition to home heating requires board approval. This has always been our policy. He's not modifying his heating system, Susan interjected. He's using a portable electric heater. That's not a modification any more than plugging in a hair dryer is a modification to the electrical system. One of the other board members, a man named Richard who'd been quiet in previous meetings, finally spoke. I think we need to be careful about setting precedents here. If we approve this without proper review, it opens the door to other requests that might not be as reasonable. What other requests? Gerald asked pointedly. What aren't we being told about? The room got tense. Patricia shot Richard a look that could have frozen water, but the damage was done. Several residents started murmuring among themselves. I decided to speak up. Can I ask a question? Has anyone else in this community ever been required to get a variance for using a space heater or any other portable electric appliance? Patricia's face tightened. That's not relevant to your application. I think it's very relevant, I said. If this is standard policy applied to everyone, fine. But if I'm being singled out, that's a problem. One of the residents in the audience, an older man I recognized as Mr. Thompson, stood up. I've lived here for 12 years, and I've never heard of anyone needing board approval for a space heater. This is absurd. Other voices joined in, and suddenly, Patricia was facing a room full of annoyed homeowners. She tried to regain control, calling for order and threatening to clear the room, but Gerald surprised everyone by calling for an immediate vote on my variance application. All in favor of approving Mr. Richardson's variance request, he said loudly. Susan's hand shot up, followed by Gerald's own hand. After a moment, Richard reluctantly raised his hand too. The other two board members, apparently sensing which way the wind was blowing, also voted in favor. Patricia was left as the only dissenting vote. The variance is approved, Gerald declared. Next item on the agenda. Patricia looked like she'd swallowed a lemon, but she had no choice but to move on. I felt a surge of relief mixed with vindication. The whole thing had been ridiculous from start to finish, but at least it was over. Or so I thought. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from a law firm in Denver. It was on behalf of the HOA, informing me that despite the variance approval, I was being assessed a $500 fine for unauthorized use of non-standard heating equipment prior to variance approval. According to the letter, I had been in violation from the date I'd installed the infrared heater until the date the variance was approved, a period of about 6 weeks. At a rate that the letter claimed was outlined in the covenants, I owed $500, payable within 30 days. I immediately called Marcus again. This time he didn't laugh. They can't do this, he said after I read him the letter. You weren't in violation. You were using a standard electric appliance. The variance requirement itself was questionable, and they approved it anyway, which essentially admits you weren't doing anything wrong. So what do? Don't pay it. Write a response disputing the fine on the grounds that you were never in violation of any valid covenant. I'll help you draft it. And Cameron, I think it might be time to consider a bigger response here. What do you mean? This Patricia person is abusing her position. What she's doing is harassment, and it's probably actionable. If she's done this to multiple residents, you might have grounds for a lawsuit against both her personally and the HOA for selective enforcement and harassment. The idea was daunting, but Marcus was right. This wasn't just about me anymore. Patricia had created a toxic environment where residents were afraid to speak up, or make any decisions about their own homes without fear of retaliation. I spent the next several days talking to other residents who'd been targeted by Patricia. The Thompsons were interested in joining any legal action. So were the Hendersons. A couple named the Johnsons had been fined repeatedly for their son's car, which Patricia claimed was an eyesore, despite being a perfectly normal Honda Civic. The more people I talked to, the more stories emerged of petty harassment and vindictive enforcement. Marcus suggested we organize a meeting separate from the official HOA meetings to discuss our options. We booked a room at the Boulder Public Library and sent out invitations through social media and door-to-door visits. We were careful to keep it off official HOA channels, knowing Patricia monitored those closely. The meeting drew nearly 40 residents, far more than ever attended the regular HOA meetings. People were fed up. Story after story emerged of Patricia's behavior. One woman, Sandra Miller, tearfully explained how Patricia had filed a complaint with the city about her home-based dog grooming business, claiming it violated zoning laws after Sandra had questioned Patricia's spending of HOA funds on new landscaping that only benefited homes on Patricia Street. Marcus outlined our legal options. We could file a lawsuit against Patricia personally for harassment and against the HOA for allowing it to continue. We could also petition to remove her as president and hold a special election for new board leadership. Or we could do both. The consensus was clear. People wanted Patricia gone, but they also wanted to make sure she couldn't do this to anyone else. We decided to pursue both legal action and a recall election. The next morning, we filed a petition with the HOA calling for a special meeting to vote on removing Patricia as president. According to the bylaws, we needed signatures from at least 20% of homeowners to force such a meeting. We had 40 signatures within 3 days. Patricia responded by calling an emergency board meeting to discuss what she termed a coordinated attack on HOA leadership. She tried to claim the petition was invalid due to technical errors, but Gerald, who'd apparently had enough of her antics, ruled that the petition met all requirements and scheduled the special meeting for 2 weeks out. The tension in the neighborhood became palpable. Patricia went into overdrive, sending letters to every homeowner warning about the dangerous precedent of removing elected leadership, and claiming that the recall effort was led by troublemakers who want to flout community rules. She even hired a lawyer who sent cease and desist letters to several of us, including me, demanding we stop defaming her. Marcus assured us the letters were toothless. We'd been careful to stick to facts and hadn't said anything defamatory. If anything, the aggressive response was just making Patricia look worse. The special meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at the community center. The day arrived with beautiful spring weather, sunny, and 65 degrees. By the time the meeting started at 2 p.m., the community center was packed with over 100 residents, far exceeding normal attendance. People lined the walls and stood in the back. Some had brought lawn chairs from home. Patricia sat at the head table with her lawyer, a stern-looking man in an expensive suit, who seemed irritated to be spending his Saturday on HOA drama. Gerald, Susan, and the other board members sat to the side, technically there to oversee the process but clearly trying to distance themselves from Patricia. Gerald, as vice president, ran the meeting. He explained the rules. Patricia would have 15 minutes to defend her leadership, then those calling for her removal would have 15 minutes to present their case. After that, there would be a vote by show of hands from all homeowners present. A simple majority was needed to remove her. Patricia went first. She stood at a podium we'd set up, her lawyer whispering something to her before she began. Her speech was defensive and accusatory. She claimed that every action she'd taken was in service of maintaining property values and community standards. She argued that those calling for her removal were malcontents who wanted to let the neighborhood fall into disrepair. She even suggested that allowing my infrared heater was the first step toward chaos and declining standards. It was a bad performance. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and several residents openly shook their heads. When she finished, there was barely any applause. I stood to present the case against her, Marcus beside me for legal support. I prepared carefully, sticking to facts and documentation. I presented a timeline of Patricia's enforcement actions over 3 years, showing how they'd increased dramatically and how they disproportionately targeted people who disagreed with her. I shared specific examples of selective enforcement, where identical situations were treated differently based on whether Patricia liked the homeowner. Then, Sandra Miller spoke about the impact Patricia's harassment had on her business and mental health. The Thompsons talked about the stress of dealing with constant scrutiny and petty citations. One by one, residents stood and shared their experiences. The mood in the room shifted from uncomfortable to angry. People who'd probably never thought much about HOA politics were suddenly engaged and outraged. Patricia's face grew redder with each testimony. When it came time to vote, Gerald called for all those in favor of removing Patricia Henderson as HOA president to raise their hands. A forest of hands shot up across the room. The count wasn't even close. Out of about 120 residents present, over 100 voted for removal. Patricia stood abruptly, knocking her chair backward. "This is a witch hunt," she shouted. "You're all making a huge mistake. Without proper leadership, this neighborhood will fall apart. You'll see. Property values will plummet and it'll be on your heads." Her lawyer put a hand on her arm, trying to calm her down, but she shook him off. "And you," she said, pointing at me. "This is all because you couldn't follow simple rules. You're a troublemaker who's poisoned this community against me." "Patricia," Gerald said firmly, "you need to leave. You're no longer president. You're no longer on the board. Please vacate your seat." For a moment, I thought she might refuse. Her face was contorted with rage, and she gripped the edge of the table. But her lawyer whispered urgently to her, and finally, she grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the community center door behind her. The room erupted in applause and relieved chatter. Gerald banged a gavel on the table, calling for order. "All right, we need to address succession. As vice president, I'll assume the role of interim president until we can hold a proper election next month. We also need to discuss reversing some of the more questionable fines and enforcement actions." The meeting continued for another hour, with residents voicing concerns and suggestions. It felt like a weight had been lifted from the entire community. People who'd been living in fear of petty retaliation could finally relax. As the meeting wrapped up, Marcus pulled me aside. "We should still consider legal action, especially if she doesn't reimburse people for unjustified fines. Let's see how the new board handles it first," I said. "If Gerald and Susan are running things, I think they'll do right by everyone." Over the next few weeks, the new board under Gerald's leadership moved quickly to undo Patricia's damage. They refunded all fines related to minor technical violations. They clarified the covenants to explicitly state that portable electric appliances didn't require board approval. They even apologized to several residents, including me, for the harassment we'd endured. My own situation was fully resolved. The $500 fine was rescinded with a formal letter of apology. The infrared heater was officially recognized as perfectly acceptable, and several other residents told me they'd bought similar units after hearing about the whole debacle. But the story didn't end there. In late May, I was working in my home office when I heard sirens outside. Looking out my window, I saw police cars pulling up to Patricia's house, 3 doors down from mine. Officers got out and approached her door. Within minutes, Patricia was being led out in handcuffs. The neighborhood erupted in speculation. By evening, the story had spread through social media and text messages. According to police reports that became public the next day, Patricia had been arrested for embezzlement. Apparently, her position as HOA president had given her access to the association's bank accounts, and she'd been systematically siphoning money for nearly 2 years. An audit triggered by the new board had uncovered discrepancies totaling over $30,000. Patricia had been writing checks to fake vendors and transferring money to personal accounts. She'd covered her tracks with falsified receipts and invoices, but once someone actually looked closely at the records, the fraud was obvious. The district attorney's office took the case seriously. Embezzlement from a homeowners association was a felony in Colorado, especially at that dollar amount. Patricia was charged with multiple counts of theft, forgery, and fraud. The local news even picked up the story, running segments about HOA corruption and residents' rights. The criminal proceedings took months to work through the system. Marcus kept me updated since he'd become somewhat involved when the HOA hired him to help recover the stolen funds. Patricia initially tried to fight the charges, claiming the money was legitimate reimbursements for HOA-related expenses. But the audit had been thorough, and the evidence was overwhelming. Her lawyer eventually negotiated a plea deal. Patricia pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony theft and 2 counts of fraud. In September, 6 months after her removal from the HOA presidency, she was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA plus penalties. The judge was particularly harsh in his remarks, noting that Patricia had abused a position of trust within her community and had harassed residents who questioned her. The sentencing brought closure to the whole saga. The neighborhood held a small celebration at the community center, not to gloat over Patricia's downfall, but to mark the beginning of a new chapter. Gerald had been officially elected as president in a proper vote, and Susan took over as vice president. They ran the HOA with a light touch, focusing on actual community needs rather than petty enforcement. As for me, I continued using my infrared heater through the following winter without any issues. In fact, several neighbors asked me about it, and I was happy to share information. The whole experience had taught me valuable lessons about standing up to bullies and the importance of community solidarity. My electric bills stayed manageable, and I never went back to the kerosene heater. The infrared technology worked well for my needs, and I didn't have to deal with storing fuel or worrying about HOA complaints. Sometimes things work out in unexpected ways. The neighborhood settled into a peaceful rhythm. Without Patricia's constant scrutiny and harassment, people felt more comfortable making minor improvements to their homes, hosting gatherings, and generally living without fear of arbitrary punishment. Property values actually increased slightly, contrary to Patricia's dire predictions, likely because potential buyers were no longer scared off by horror stories of HOA tyranny. I occasionally thought about how a simple decision to use a kerosene heater had set off such a chain of events. If Patricia hadn't targeted me, if I hadn't pushed back, the embezzlement might have continued for years. The community might have remained under her thumb indefinitely, with residents suffering in silence. The whole situation reinforced my belief that sometimes you have to fight back against unreasonable authority, even when it's easier to just comply. Standing up to Patricia had been stressful and time-consuming, but it had ultimately made life better not just for me, but for over 100 families in our neighborhood. As winter approached again, I fired up my infrared heater without a second thought. The warmth spread through my living room, and Mr. Whiskers took his usual spot nearby. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, blanketing pinewood meadows in white. It was peaceful, quiet, and most importantly, free from HOA drama. Gerald had proven to be an excellent president, focusing on actual community needs like road maintenance and common area improvements, rather than policing residents' personal choices. The board meetings became productive and even pleasant, with real discussions about how to make the neighborhood better rather than Patricia's constant enforcement agenda. The financial impact of Patricia's theft had been significant, but the HOA's insurance covered most of it, and the restitution order meant the association would eventually recover the full amount, even if it took years. More importantly, the new board implemented proper financial controls and oversight to prevent anything similar from happening in the future. All significant expenditures now required approval from multiple board members, and the books were audited quarterly by an independent accountant. I ran into Deborah Brooks at the grocery store in December, and we had a good laugh about the whole situation. She admitted she'd been terrified of Patricia and had stayed quiet to avoid becoming a target herself. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said. "If more of us had stood together earlier, maybe we could have stopped her before it got so bad." "Don't beat yourself up," I told her. "Sometimes it takes one situation to catalyze change. The important thing is that it's over now." The holidays came and went without incident. No one worried about taking down their Christmas lights on exactly the right day. No one stressed about HOA citations for minor infractions. It felt like living in a normal neighborhood instead of a police state. In January, I got an email from Marcus. Patricia's appeals had been denied, and she was officially serving her sentence at the Colorado Women's Correctional Facility in Cannon City. He'd also successfully recovered a significant portion of the stolen funds by placing liens on Patricia's assets, including her house, which had been sold to satisfy the restitution order. Her husband, who'd apparently been oblivious to the whole scheme, had divorced her and moved out of state. It was a sad ending in some ways. Patricia had destroyed her life over what amounted to petty theft and a desire for control. If she'd just done her job properly and treated residents with respect, she'd still be living in her nice house in Boulder, enjoying retirement. Instead, she was in prison, her marriage was over, and her reputation was in ruins. But I found it hard to feel too sorry for her. She'd made her choices, and those choices had hurt a lot of people. The harassment, the fraudulent fines, the embezzlement, they were all symptoms of someone who'd let a tiny bit of power go to her head and had decided that her judgment was the only one that mattered. As spring rolled around again, marking 2 years since the whole kerosene heater incident had begun, I reflected on how much had changed. The HOA was functioning properly under Gerald's leadership. The community felt friendlier and more cohesive. People waved to each other, chatted at the mailboxes, and weren't constantly looking over their shoulders for Patricia's next violation notice. I'd also learned a lot about HOAs in general. They could be useful for managing shared spaces and maintaining community standards, but they could also be hijacked by petty tyrants if residents weren't paying attention. The key was engagement. When people stayed informed, attended meetings, and held leadership accountable, HOAs worked fine. When everyone checked out and left things to whoever wanted the power, you ended up with situations like ours had been. My infrared heater continued to serve me well. I'd calculated that it saved me about $60 a month compared to running my furnace constantly, which meant it had paid for itself in just 4 months. The energy efficiency was as good as advertised, and I liked that it provided instant warmth without having to wait for air to heat up and circulate. Several neighbors had bought similar units, and we joke about being part of the infrared heating club. It was funny how something that had started as a source of conflict had become a point of connection in the community. In May, the HOA held its annual meeting and elections. Gerald ran for a full term as president and won easily. Susan continued as vice president. 3 new board members were elected, all people who'd been involved in the recall effort and who shared a vision of the HOA as a service organization rather than an enforcement agency. During the meeting, Gerald gave a speech about the past year and the lessons learned. "We've seen what happens when power goes unchecked," he said. "We've experienced the damage that one person can do when they prioritize control over community. Moving forward, this board commits to transparency, accountability, and treating all residents with respect. We work for you, not the other way around." The room erupted in applause. It was a complete transformation from the tense, fearful atmosphere of meetings under Patricia's leadership. As the meeting wrapped up, several people came over to thank me for standing up to Patricia and starting the chain of events that led to her removal. I was a bit embarrassed by the attention but appreciated the sentiment. "I just wanted to use my heater," I joked. "I didn't set out to start a revolution. But maybe that's how change often happens. Someone stands up over something small, and it exposes bigger problems that everyone knew existed but no one wanted to address." My refusal to be bullied over a heating choice had pulled the thread that unraveled Patricia's entire scheme. Life settled into a comfortable routine over the following months. Work was going well, with my software development career advancing nicely. The neighborhood remained peaceful and friendly. My house stayed warm in winter with my trusty infrared heater. Mr. Whiskers grew fat and lazy, which the vet said I needed to address, but that was a problem for another day. I occasionally drove past Patricia's old house, now occupied by a young family with 2 kids. They were friendly and got along well with everyone on the street. It was like the dark cloud that had hung over that property had finally lifted. The final piece of closure came in August when Marcus called to tell me that the restitution had been paid in full. Between the sale of Patricia's house, her car, and other assets, the HOA had recovered all $30,000 plus interest and penalties. The money was being used to make long overdue improvements to the common areas, including new playground equipment and resurfacing the walking trails that wound through the neighborhood. "It's really over," Marcus said. "Patricia is still serving her sentence, and she'll be on probation for years after she gets out, but the legal side of things is wrapped up." I thanked him for all his help and hung up feeling genuinely happy. Justice had been served, the community was better off, and life could move forward. That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset through my window. The infrared heater sat quietly in the corner, unplugged for the summer but ready for when cold weather returned. It was just a simple appliance, nothing special, but it had become a symbol of something larger. It represented the idea that individuals have the right to make reasonable decisions about their own homes without arbitrary interference. It stood for the principle that those in power need to be held accountable. And it reminded me that sometimes standing up for something small can lead to big changes. As darkness fell over Pinewood Meadows, I felt grateful for where I lived and the community we'd built together. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and we'd fought to make it better. That was worth more than any amount of money or any perfectly maintained property value. The HOA was what it should be: a tool for managing shared resources and maintaining community standards without infringing on personal freedom. Patricia's reign of terror was over, replaced by reasonable leadership that respected residents' rights while still maintaining the neighborhood we all valued. I finished my coffee and headed to bed, secure in the knowledge that I could heat my home however I wanted, within reason, without fear of harassment or retaliation. It was a simple freedom, one that most people probably took for granted, but I'd learned not to take it for granted. I'd fought for it, and in the process, had helped free an entire community from a petty tyrant. The story of the kerosene heater and the infrared heater would probably become neighborhood legend, told to new residents as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and a hopeful story about community action. And I was okay with that. If my experience could help others stand up against unreasonable authority, then all the stress and frustration had been worth it. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I thought about the journey from that cold January morning when I'd first bought the kerosene heater to this warm August evening with everything resolved. It had been quite a ride, full of conflict and drama and unexpected twists. But in the end, good had prevailed over pettiness, community over tyranny, and justice over corruption. And I had my infrared heater, quietly waiting in the corner for winter to return, a monument to the idea that sometimes the smallest things can spark the biggest changes. It was more than just a heating device now. It was a reminder that standing up for what's right, even in small matters, can lead to outcomes you never imagined. The neighborhood of Pinewood Meadows was finally at peace, and I was proud to be a part of it. The HOA functioned as it should. Neighbors trusted each other again, and everyone could live their lives without constant fear of arbitrary rules and vindictive enforcement. It was everything a community should be, and it had taken a fight to get there. But we'd won that fight, and the victory belonged to all of us who'd stood together against Patricia's abuse of power. My infrared heater had been the catalyst, the spark that lit the fire of resistance, and I'd never look at it the same way again. It was, in its own quiet way, a symbol of freedom and the power of ordinary people to stand up against those who would control them.